Hi, I'm Hank Bitton, Project Director for our Teach American History grant here in New Jersey, Profiles and Perspectives in American History. And here's my good friend, professor from Drew University and lifelong friend, Perry Level.
Yes, thank you very much, yes, right.
And one of the things we're so excited about is just watching the way our teachers from middle schools and high schools engage in primary documents, the enlightening ideas that they get. We've had some fantastic discussions on the engage in primary documents, the enlightening ideas that they get. We've had some fantastic discussions on the Jay Treaty, local history of the Loyalists and Patriots during the American Revolution, and of course right here, this is the house where George Washington was, okay, 1777, the height of the Revolutionary War in New Jersey at such a critical time. And it was the home of a Loyalist, right, Perry?
Right.
Okay, Captain James Prevost, who lived here as well. So this is a great landmark for New Jersey.
Yes, and it's been fun, the excitement that's generated by all of this, the discussions with the group.
It's been fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Barbara Oberg. I'm at Princeton University, and I want to say first I was so thrilled when Hank asked me to be part of this Teaching American History grant. Because at Princeton we like to reach out to high school teachers, to a wider community. And my colleague John Murren and I had an absolutely terrific day meeting all the teachers and talking to them about the history that we love of the United States.
And in addition to our work with Barbara, which has been really outstanding, we've also built partnerships with Dr. Maxine Lurie at Seton Hall. We'll be working with Rutgers scholars this summer in the Susan B. Anthony papers. And also Michael Holt from the University of Virginia will be with us in the fall. So we're very excited that we continue to be able to build these relationships and connect our teachers with some of the best scholars and best historical research facilities in the country.
So we all have fun with it.
Yeah.
On a real local basis, it's important and it's exciting for someone like myself, a member of the Core Steering Committee and the LEA Lead District of Ridgewood, to tap into some of the real local wealth in Bergen County in terms of academic areas of interest. One of the partnerships that we currently have is with the Hermitage in Ho-Ho-Kus. It's the former home of the Burr family, and tapping into the resident scholar, Dr. Bischoff here, is a real treat, and it's just around the corner. So we get to see our parents, we get to see our teachers, our scholars and residents get to tap into something that's real local based.
Maybe a little deal, and see if that would spark a little attention to wake everybody up along about now. You're embarking on a year-long, 5-year-long, depending, I guess, for each one of you how long, journey here. You should indeed have a great deal of fun over the next few years. Along the way, of course, the goal is to improve learning in your classrooms. So I want to think about that a little bit. And I want to speak to you really as one historian to others, as one history teacher to others, and some kinds of things that I think might work and might be interesting, and so forth. Recently, 3 or 4 years ago, I read a popular novel that had a description of an effective teacher. You may have seen the book, you may even have read it. It was the story of time. If you remember it, it was the story of a tiger and a boy, and they were on a ship, and the ship went down, and they ended up on a boat together. And they proceed to survive throughout the length of this book by discovering their self-interest, how they could satisfy each other's self-interest. The boy would catch fish and feed it to the tiger. That satisfied his self-interest. And the tiger did not eat the boy, which satisfied the boy's self-interest, if you will. And they endured for quite a long while out on the water and so forth. Well, the boy described the effect of a great teacher on him. He said, this teacher climbed into the dark cave of his skull and lit a candle. Wow, that's pretty dramatic. It's pretty colorful. On the other hand, it seems to me that's part of what, as teachers, we want to do, is enlighten, ignite enthusiasm, get people to look at the world and to do in different ways, perhaps. Well, speaking of tigers, Thomas Jefferson once said, I would like to see a history written from the perspective of a tiger. I can't do that for you. But one of my favorite essays in American history is an essay that was written a number of years ago. It was American history from the perspective of a beaver. Now think about it for a minute. Back in the 17th century, America was a utopia for beavers. Absolutely a utopia. You had loads of water, you had lots of wood to build houses, you had a lot of climate. Boy, did they thrive. Nobody knows how many beavers were here. Billions of beaver were here. And then suddenly these Europeans arrived, and they had this form, they had this style, beaver hats. Every gentleman in Europe and America needed a beaver hat. And everybody went out then and started, right, catching beaver and taking the fur and so forth. People prospered from that, a whole big business grew on that. Probably the first American millionaire, John Jacob Astor. That million was forged off of, was earned off of the skin of beaver, if you will. Of course, the result of all this is that by 1900, beaver almost extinct. They almost didn't exist at all. Looked at from the perspective of a beaver, American history is a disaster. It's a total catastrophe. It destroyed everything, if you will, in their lives. Perspective counts. Another story, maybe related to that, just for a moment. A few years ago, I was asked to go and give a talk to a group of Jewel alums out on Long Island. They were meeting in a new pub that had opened. They wanted a history professor to come talk a little about history, but not too seriously, be a little entertaining, and so forth too. So I developed a talk that became quite popular. It was American history from the perspective of a beer drinker, with focus on presidents. When you look at American presidents from the perspective of a beer drinker, George Washington isn't really very high on your list. He liked rum, he wasn't much of a beer drinker. Abraham Lincoln was always listed among the great presidents. Didn't drink much beer at all. Franklin Roosevelt loved martinis. He didn't care for beer, if you will. From the perspective of a beer drinker, probably the greatest American president, and he looked like it, was Grover Cleveland. Wow, 300 pounds of Grover Cleveland, right? Who sat in many a saloon in Buffalo. Who drank a lot of beer, they ate a lot of German sausage. Looked at from the perspective of a beer drinker, suddenly the history of American presidents looks radically different from what it did before. My point's a simple one. Perspective matters. The point, I suppose, is we want our students to know that perspective matters. Where you're looking from, the angle you're looking at things from, can matter a great deal. Probably the angle, the perspective of most students coming in, or at least certainly some, a nice big number, is a certain kind of triumphalism. America is a great triumph. We started with little bitty colonies, and then we grow and we become a great big nation, and then we become a world power, and then we become a superpower. And we had problems along the way. There were race problems, and there were these problems, and there were that problems, but we triumphed over them and became the great people that we are today. That's a fairly widespread view of American history. It's a fairly widespread perspective of American history. Part of our job, it seems to me, is to try to find and help students find somewhat more complex perspectives, somewhat more sophisticated perspectives. Part of what we do is show them that different perspectives can have different consequences for the way that you view things.
I just want to show you this before we went on to the other. And it is important, let's say, in terms of New Jersey, because one of the people that writes that 1776 Constitution for New Jersey writes, he'd been in the Continental Congress, he writes to John Adams, and this is a couple days before they meet and write it, and he writes to John Adams and he says, we are going to have a republic and we're going to have it in a week. And no more kings, right? And I think they had something very specific in mind. The compromise, which is really what New Jersey forces. So you end up with the Senate, you end up with the House, and then again, Supreme Court, the President, and this crazy institution, the Electoral College, which, you know, we always have our doubts about every now and then, especially in certain elections. But it is a last-minute compromise, and that's sometimes this makes, if you live in a world where there's no newspapers, there's no television, there's no radio, where there is no national audience yet, it makes sense. This is why they come up with it. They're trying to get a national candidate out of a very different time period. Okay, somebody in there.
I'm just wondering you know, some of the other things we could see where we got those ideas from, you know, from England Parliament. But where did the Electoral College idea come from? I mean,
A last-minute
bizarre
compromise.
yeah.
And we think it's bizarre, but I think the way to explain it to students is to say, okay, how? So the Electoral College, each state gets the same number of electors as you have representatives and senators. And then each elector votes for two candidates, and remember we get in trouble because they don't say which is for what. So in 1800 you have this tied election. But also electors can only vote for one person who lived in their state. The other person has to be from, they're trying to get away from a world in which there isn't yet a national audience, there isn't yet a national you know, public media, really. And so they're trying to get a way to come up and elect people. Because, okay, so a very close call in many places. That's not close in New Jersey. New Jersey is the third state to ratify. It does it unanimously. It's, if I remember right, it's the first state to actually call for the election of a ratifying convention. It's not the first one to hold it, but the first one to call for it. I've done research on it, or tried to. They meet for a week. There's minutes of the meeting, and the minutes say we debated, period. Not what they discussed, not if anybody was for. It's very frustrating as the researcher. What were you saying? Can't tell. Okay, but it's also very clear in New Jersey that there really is no opposition to the Constitution. Maybe Abraham Clark, but he never publicly comes out and says no, because it's also doing some of the things he had wanted, which was giving this national government the power to tax. So New Jersey isn't taxed twice. There are no anti-federalists. The New Jersey Constitutional Ratifying Convention meets, and fiery John Witherspoon is a delegate, and he votes for ratification of this too. So it's kind of interesting. They meet for, as I said, for a week, and then vote, and they ratify unanimously. I want to talk about John Stevens, and then I'll go and say just a little bit more about that. Okay, about the only Federalist pamphlets for New Jersey are written by John Stevens. His father heads that New Jersey Ratifying Convention. He writes a series of 7 pamphlets. They appear in the New York papers. Then as now, New Jersey got a lot of its news from New York and Philadelphia. They appear in the New York papers. They are also used as they're part of the debate for the ratification in New York. But when he starts to write them, the first ones appear before the New Jersey Ratifying Convention is met. And he's a New Jersey figure. He's really addressing them. And he argues, and I think he's kind of fun because he uses the same arguments that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay use in the Federalist Papers. Not only that, but when I did research on him, I opened an original paper from 1787. This was just before the New Jersey Convention meets. And lo and behold, what I found, Federalist number 15 on one side of the page, and here is Stevens' Americanist essay on the other side of the page. So those essays were actually published, making some of the same arguments in the papers at the same time.
I have a question. How were the people who actually went to the ratifying convention, how were they selected?
They're all elected just the way you would elect members to the legislature.
So there was a special election for the members to the ratifying convention?
Yeah, that's what happens. When William Livingston, when the convention ends, he's the governor, he's been at least part of the ratifying convention, comes back and they call for a special election. And they elect delegates.